Henry VIII was the notorious King of England who was responsible for the executions of 2 of his 6 wives. He was a man who was known for turning on his closest friends and then regretting these actions later. But he was a man who was more than happy to administer torture and suffering onto people to get information and intelligence about crimes and possible traitors. However, there was a case for almost all 6 wives at one point or another being suspected of crimes and other actions that could have resulted in their executions. To be married to the king was a very dangerous thing, and it was something that each of these women had little say in, as if the king came calling, then they could not say no. But how many of Henry's wives could have lost their heads and been executed? Let's have a look at each of them. Catherine of Aragon was the wife of King Henry VIII, who was married to him the longest, and she was of course his first wife. Catherine was married previously to Henry's brother Arthur and remained in England almost under house arrest as Henry VIII's father was refusing to return the dowry payment given to him by Catherine's family. But Catherine and Henry's marriage was initially happy, until the king had a wandering eye, and that made him look towards other women, including Anne Boleyn. But much of the king and Catherine's latter relationship was dominated by chaos, especially as the king tried to divorce his wife, but there was little he could do. She was a Spanish princess in her own right, and was a popular queen, but Catherine was frustrating the king as he tried anything he could to rid himself of his first marriage, and then could not do this, as the Pope would not allow him. Because of this, the king would do as he wanted, but at a cost. He split England from Rome and declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and then got rid of Catherine, who had been banished from the royal court and had lost her apartments. But Henry VIII must have believed that it would have been impossible to have Catherine executed, as she was a Spanish princess. It would have been a way that he could have got what he wanted, and it's possible he may have been planning to poison and rid himself of his first wife once and for all. This would have been a possibility, especially as Catherine was held in her final years virtually under house arrest, and there was talk at the time of Catherine's death that she may have been poisoned at the behest of the king. But Henry could never have ordered her execution because of her status, no matter how much he wanted to. Henry VIII obviously would get rid of his second wife, Anne Boleyn, in the most barbaric way, as she was executed inside of the walls of the Tower of London on the 19th of May 1536. Anne's execution came as Henry VIII was frustrated because of the lack of male heirs that his second wife would produce. She did give birth to the greatest Tudor monarch, Elizabeth I. However, this would not save Anne. For Anne's execution, the king planned every single detail, and before she was even condemned to death, he had ordered the executioner to come from France, armed with his sword to take her head. Today, Anne is considered a tragic victim of her husband and Thomas Cromwell, who murdered her with the false justification of an execution and false charges that she was accused of. The wife of Henry VIII, who wasn't really considered in any negative way by the king and his courtiers, was Jane Seymour. The relationship she had with the king was one which emerged during his second marriage, and Jane would give Henry VIII everything he wanted, in the form of a male heir, Edward VI. Jane Seymour, however, would never make it out of Hampton Court Palace alive after childbirth, as she succumbed to childbirth fever or some illness afterwards. The story of Jane's life is one which is tinged with sadness, especially in the latter years, and she was a wife who was very different to the others that Henry had married. She was not the most highly educated, but if Jane would have survived, then it's likely that Henry would have stopped with looking for other wives to provide him with what he greatly desired. But what came after her death was nothing short of scandalous and shambolic. Talking of shambolic, Henry VIII's marriage to Anne of Cleves was just that. The king married the German princess shortly after Jane's death, and marriage negotiations were overseen by Thomas Cromwell, who would also be a victim of the downfall and fallout of this fourth marriage. When Anne came to England, she did not even recognise the king, and she embarrassed Henry with this. He hit back, accusing her of not being very beautiful and saying she looked like the Mayor of Flanders. But Henry VIII was cordial to her in the aftermath of the failed marriage. It did not last long, and Henry did not want to get married to Anne of Cleves, but he had to, as the negotiations had gone too far. The marriage cost Henry greatly, as he had to give over a huge amount of wealth and land to Anne of Cleves, and the tyrannical king would probably have preferred a more straightforward execution, which would have been less costly, but this would have never occurred purely because of Anne's status as a wealthy princess, and if he would have tried anything like this, then it's certain that war would have occurred. But Anne of Cleves lived out the rest of her life in comfort, and was regarded as the king's sister, and she would also be the longest living of Henry's 6 wives. Catherine Howard was the king's 5th wife, and she also too lost her head inside of the Tower of London on the 13th of February 1542. Catherine, who many historians believe was in fact a teenage girl of around 16, made her way to the scaffold inside of the tower for her execution. She was not given a swordsman, but instead died by the commoner's axe for committing adultery and treason on her husband Henry VIII, and much of this sin was committed with the king's close friend Thomas Culpeper. Catherine Howard was one of the most tragic figures in English history, and she was certainly a victim of her husband's brutal nature. But much would be spoken about in the circles of the king's household, and rumours turned to evidence when the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, informed the king that his 5th, much younger wife was cheating on him. However, one woman who could very easily have lost her head for her actions and beliefs was the king's 6th and final wife, Catherine Parr. Parr is considered a woman who was a survivor. However, she was very close to execution. She had incredibly strong Protestant beliefs, and because of this, she was under suspicion by the king's most senior churchmen, who were concerned that she would influence her husband to change further things with the church and with worship in England. Because of this, many people began to suspect the Queen, especially as they feared for their own jobs. Catherine fell under investigation, and because of this, a number of people, including women, were tortured for being linked to Catherine. Anne Askew, a woman who was held inside the Tower of London, was even racked and then burned alive, as she was considered a woman who was linked to the king's 6th wife. But Catherine and the king would reconcile their differences with regards to religion. But if Catherine had fell under further suspicion and evidence of heresy was gathered against her, she could have faced a number of fates. The first was that she could have been burnt at the stake, and also she could have been executed by hanging or beheading. Heresy and religious crimes were some of the most serious at the time, and because of this, she escaped execution due to the king being in his final days. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.